Recession of 1908 neared, the United States and Teddy Roosevelt were in an increasingly difficult situation. The nation was recovering from a financial panic that had rocked Wall Street and businesses the previous year. Many leading industrialists had blamed the crisis on President Roosevelt, calling it the Roosevelt Recession. The Congress that he had been able to work with easily in his first term was now dominated by conservative Republicans who were regularly blocking his initiatives. And during the campaign of 1904, he had promised not to seek a third term if he were to win that year, as he considered the 3.5 years that he'd served of McKinley's term to be his first term. And no prior president had ever broken the two-term tradition. Roosevelt would keep his word, even though he was somewhat regretting that decision. Since he was man of his word and could no longer serve as president, his next best option was to name a successor who would carry out his programs and policies. And he thought he found the perfect candidate in William Howard Taft. Taft and Roosevelt were quite good friends. When Roosevelt had been sworn in as president, Taft had been serving as the governor of the Philippines. Roosevelt offered his friend a seat on the Supreme Court, which was Taft's lifelong dream. But his work in the Philippines and the ambitions of Mrs. Taft propelled him to decline, since it wasn't the Chief Justice position, which is what he really wanted. Later, though, in 1904, Taft became the Secretary of War after Elihu Root, and his friendship with Roosevelt grew stronger. By 1908, Roosevelt was convinced that Taft would be the ideal successor, and Roosevelt's support propelled Taft to the Republican nomination. The Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan again, and the Socialists chose Eugene V. Debs. The election, though, proved to be a landslide victory for Taft, largely because of the progressive movement, the support of progressivism that Taft campaigned on, and the support of Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt set off on a world tour and African safari, confident that his progressive measures would continue under Taft. But Taft lacked the political skill of Roosevelt to keep both the progressive and conservative wings of the Republican Party happy. He was going to alienate one side or the other. The defining moment came with the passage of the Payne-Aldrich tariff. The tariff had long been a target of progressives because they saw high tariff rates as harmful to the people and only beneficial to the already wealthy industrialists. Progressives hated the Payne-Aldrich tariff because it actually raised rates overall, though some items would be lowered. Naturally, the conservatives loved it. When it arrived on his desk, Taft signed the bill, and his progressive supporters were furious. He also angered progressives in his own party when he created the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in 1912, viewed by many as an attempt to offset the growing influence of the labor union movement at that time. But the division between progressive Republicans and conservative Republicans got even worse with the Ballinger-Pinchot controversy. Richard Ballinger was Taft's Secretary of the Interior, and his appointment shocked Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester and longtime companion of Theodore Roosevelt, because Ballinger had previously worked for a company that used federal land for its resources. Pinchot saw that Ballinger wasn't a friend to Roosevelt's conservation initiatives. And when Pinchot publicly criticized Ballinger for selling millions of acres of federal land to the company that he had previously worked for, Taft fired Pinchot for insubordination. And progressives were again outraged. Basically, the two branches of the Republican Party were on a collision course. Despite the criticism from progressive Republicans, though, Taft did actually support many of their goals. He broke up twice as many trusts in his one term as Roosevelt had broken in his two. Taft limited the workday of federal employees to 8 hours and supported the passage of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which would allow Congress to place an income tax. He also created a Children's Bureau and supported the passage of the 17th Amendment, which allowed for senators to be directly elected by the people instead of state legislatures. Still, when Roosevelt returned to America after his grand tour, progressives pressed him to challenge Taft for the party leadership. They were becoming angry with Taft because it seemed as if the Republican Party was moving away from progressivism. Now, some defenders of Roosevelt insist that Taft was betraying the progressive platform, and they wanted Theodore Roosevelt to lead them once again. Roosevelt generally believed that he could do a better job uniting the Republican Party than Taft. But ultimately, the party nomination went to Taft, even though most of the primary elections, at least in states that had them, were won by Roosevelt. Still, Roosevelt felt a duty to the American people to run anyway, a decision that would ultimately derail Robert La Follette of Wisconsin from consideration as an alternate candidate. So even though Roosevelt had won the primaries, Taft was nominated by the Republicans because of the way in which the nominating convention was done, where party leadership had a greater say than the people. So Roosevelt and La Follette's supporters left the convention and formed a new Progressive Party, which then nominated Theodore Roosevelt for the presidency. Taft might have had the party leadership behind him, but Roosevelt had the people. During the general campaign, Roosevelt spoke of a new nationalism, a broad plan of social reform for America. Rather than destroying every trust, he wanted to create a Federal Trade Commission which would keep an eye on unfair business practices. He suggested a minimum wage, a workers' compensation act, and a child labor law. He even proposed a government pension for retirees and funds to assist Americans with health care costs. He supported the women's suffrage amendment, believing that the time of laissez-faire was over and the government must intervene to help its people. Taft and his supporters disagreed. But progressives didn't exist just amongst the Republicans. Woodrow Wilson also saw the need for change. Born in Virginia, he had previously served as the president of Princeton University and the governor of New Jersey. So he combined a Southern background with Northern sensibilities. He was able to secure the Democratic nomination in 1912 and called his platform for change the New Freedom. He was actually an admirer of Thomas Jefferson, though he felt that the agrarian utopia of small educated farmers, not quite feasible with industry in a modern society, but still something that could be built on. Small farmers and small businesses definitely seemed possible. He wanted to open the doors of economic opportunities through drastic tariff reduction, banking reform, and antitrust legislation. With the Republican progressive split between the Republican and mildly progressive Taft and the progressive and mildly Republican Roosevelt, Wilson, who had progressive Democratic support, was able to claim a landslide victory, 435 to 88 to 8. In fact, the 8 electoral votes that sitting president William Howard Taft got is the lowest electoral vote total for any sitting president ever. Wilson's New Freedom Plan was simple: regulate the banks and big businesses and lower tariff rates to increase international trade, increasing competition in the interests of consumers. He sought to achieve this vision by attacking what he called the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. Tariffs protected the large industrialists at the expense of small farmers. So Wilson took the unusual step of calling a special session of Congress in April of 1930 to tackle the issue. It resulted in the Revenue Act of 1913, also known as the Underwood Tariff Act or the Underwood-Simmons Act. It lowered tariff rates across the board by approximately 15% and completely eliminated tariffs on several key imports, including steel, iron ore, woolen products, and farm tools. To offset the potential loss of federal revenue, this law reinstituted the federal income tax, which was now allowed because of the ratification of the 16th Amendment. This first income tax required married couples who earned $4,000 or more and single people who earned $3,000 or more to pay a 1% graduated income tax, with the tax rate getting progressively higher for those who earned more money. The banking system also was seen as hurting small farmers and businesses. The gold standard still made currency too difficult to obtain, and loans were too expensive for the average American. So late in 1913, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act to regulate the banking industry and establish a federal banking system. This federal banking system is kind of like a system of banks for banks rather than for private individuals. Designed to remove power over interest rates from the hand of private bankers, the new system created 12 privately owned regional reserve banks, regulated by a presidentially appointed Federal Reserve Board. The board, known informally as the Fed, would regulate the interest rate at which reserve banks loaned or distributed money to other banks throughout the country. Thus, when economic times were challenging, such as during a recession, the Fed could lower this discount rate to encourage more borrowing, which would put more currency in circulation for people to spend or invest. On the other hand, the Fed could slow down inflationary trends by increasing interest rates, which would discourage borrowing. This system is still the basis for the country's modern banking model. The Federal Reserve also issued a national currency called Federal Reserve Notes, and they would be distributed across the country and held at the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. The idea was to make money easily available to banks that might need it when they needed it, rather than waiting days for it to be shipped from Washington. Currency, as it is printed, is labeled with its originating Federal Reserve Bank's code, the code appearing in the serial number on each bill. The codes for each district are as follows, with A for Boston, B for New York, C for Philadelphia, D for Cleveland, E for Richmond, F for Atlanta, G for Chicago, H for St. Louis, I for Minneapolis, J for Kansas City, K for Dallas, and L for San Francisco. On $1 and $2 bills, it's the first letter of the serial number that corresponds to the specific bank. On higher denomination bills, at least those that have been issued since 1996, it's the second letter of the serial number. The third part of Wilson's triple wall of privilege was dealing with the trusts. In early 1914, Wilson completed this new freedom agenda with the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act. Unlike Roosevelt, Wilson did not distinguish between good and bad trusts. Any trust, by virtue of its large size, was bad in his eyes. The law expanded the power of the original Sherman Antitrust Act in order to allow the investigation of dismantling of more monopolies. The new act also took on the so-called interlocking directorates, competing companies that still operated together, creating sort of a conspiracy that would restrain trade. The same act, though, also exempted labor unions from antitrust lawsuits and declared that union actions such as strikes, boycotts, and peaceful voting to be perfectly legal. With his new freedom agenda complete, Wilson could now turn his attention to foreign affairs, as war was quickly encompassing Europe. But as the 1916 election approached and Wilson's focus was on foreign affairs, he began to worry about the fact that 60% of the nation had not voted for him. So they might not exactly be likely to change their minds. So realizing this, Wilson began a flurry of new progressive reforms that impressed the voting public and would be the last wave of legislation of the Progressive era. Some of the important measures that Wilson undertook to pass during this time included the Federal Farm Act, which would provide oversight of low-interest loans to millions of farmers who were in need of debt relief. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which, although it was later deemed unconstitutional, prohibited the interstate distribution of products created by child workers under the age of 14. And he also signed the Adamson Act, which put into place the first federally mandated 8-hour workday for railroad workers. He also approved of the creation of a Federal Trade Commission to act as a watchdog over business. And he even gained significant support from Jewish voters with his 1916 appointment to the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. Finally, Wilson gained the support of many working-class voters with his defense of labor and union rights during a violent coal strike in Colorado.